So 50% of the population is trusting humans more than AI, and 50% is really doing the opposite. I plan to spend my next 20 minutes on a topic on how should humans and AI collaborate. So what are we actually good at, respectively? So my name is Daniel Akkenainen. I work as the CTO for Microsoft in Sweden. I also founded an initiative called Add AI that is working with ethical AI and the social aspects of AI. So let's start. I think there is a lot of misconceptions actually on what artificial intelligence actually can do. So I wanted to start the presentation with trying to get a little bit deeper into the topic what AI actually can and can't do. So basically there is two types of knowledge in this world. So there is one type of knowledge that you could call explicit knowledge. And that type of knowledge is really knowledge that you can write down. So if I want to give you some type of knowledge or some type of information, like, for instance, how do I fix a flat tire on my bicycle, I could basically write that knowledge down. So I could write it down, or I could create a movie that I could upload on YouTube, and you could watch that movie and you could basically get that information. So it's basically information and knowledge that you are able to write down. And then there is another type of knowledge as well, and you could call it implicit knowledge or tacit knowledge in English. So it's another type of information that is basically things like driving a car, for instance. Driving a car is not something that you just can learn by reading a book. So if you're interested in getting to become a very good tennis player, it's not really possible to just take up a book of how do you play tennis and read that from the first page to the last and, you know, apply for Wimbledon. You have to do something else. There's other types of knowledges as well. So I find there is one type of knowledge that you are all experts on, and that's things like recognizing a picture. So if I would ask you how you actually do that, how do you recognize my face from another face? How do you recognize a dog from a cat? So even though you have that type of knowledge, you are not able to actually write that knowledge down. And this is kind of important. This is knowledge that you cannot really explain. And then I would like to go to some of the newer AI systems that we are seeing today. This is something called Microsoft Caption Bot. So the Microsoft Caption Bot says like this: I can understand the content of any photograph that you upload, and I will try to describe it for you. So if you upload a picture of cows standing on a field, it basically says that I think this is a herd of cattle which is standing on a field. And this obviously looks like a pretty simple solution, but it's not. This is the result of decades of research in both computer vision and machine learning and deep learning from the last 12, 18 months. So the interesting thing here is, if you remember, I said implicit knowledge, like recognizing a picture, is something that is kind of new. It's typically human. So the thing is, have we started to develop really AI and bots and technology that is really getting this implicit knowledge understanding? And I think this is where the confusion actually lies, because I would say no, we are not there. Because what we have today is actually AI that is very successful to simulate that it has that type of knowledge. So it appears that it has that knowledge, but it doesn't really understand that this is cows on the field, even though it can tell you. And in sometimes this is actually even better than humans, and it's going to be better than humans. So what you're seeing now is that we are seeing image recognition, for instance, cancer detection and tumor detection, that is better if you do it algorithm-wise than you do it human-wise. So we're seeing this being very successful in specific areas. But I think it's something that we need to remember. This is still algorithms, and they don't have the basic concepts that we have. And then I will go into the next area then. If we understand what AI can and can't do today, how would that kind of knowledge or how would that kind of expertise basically impact humans? And I think one thing that we could do is looking up to get some guidance from that. And what I mean by saying we should look up is not necessarily look up in the ceiling. What I'm saying is that we should look up to the airline industry, because there has been a kind of a very interesting development there for the last 40 or 50 years. So if we see the origin of basically commercial airline trafficking, the original crew on an airplane was 5 people. So you had to have a pilot, you had to have a co-pilot, you had to have a navigator, a radio man, and an engineer if you wanted to take off with passengers. What happened during the next kind of decades was kind of interesting. So in the 50s, the radio man disappeared from the crew, so you could actually do radioing. It became simpler as well, so you didn't have a full-time person there. In the 60s, the navigator disappeared. So they didn't have a GPS in the 60s, but you had a lot of other technology, so it basically automated away humans in that equation. In the 70s, the engineer disappeared. You really had so stable airplanes and you couldn't do something anyway if something crashed in the middle of the air. And in the 80s, actually in 1981, you had a current regulation from commercial airline trafficking, which basically says you need 2 persons. So you need to have a pilot and you need to have a co-pilot to be able to take off with the commercial airline. And what they are discussing in the airline industry right now is kind of an interesting concept. And it's basically this. Is that actually 2 persons too many? Are we ready to basically automate the airlines and remove all humans from the equation? And I think this is really putting it to the test. If we are kind of accepting this or not, do we trust AI, do we trust technology enough to actually allow that to happen? And what you could say is that you have 2 different types of architectures here. So you have 2 different types of scenarios. So think about it. Which would you actually prefer? And I will ask you actually that question in 20 seconds or so. Because you have 2 scenarios. You could think about one scenario where you actually would go into an airplane, and would you then prefer an airplane where the autopilot is basically has command of the airplane? So the autopilot could look at the pilot. It could say, I think you're doing something wrong, and I'm going to take over, and you can't do anything about it. Or would you rather have an airplane where the pilot is the person that could always take control over the plane and basically, disconnect the autopilot? So how many of you would prefer to fly in the first type of airplane? Basically where the autopilot can take command. Yes, it's approximately half. So the rest of you, how many would like to fly in an airplane while the pilot is there? Yeah. So this is kind of an interesting test because it really shows, and I've done that test for many times, and it always is approximately 50-50. So 50% of the population is trusting humans more than AI, and 50% is really doing the opposite. You could also think about actually what kind of airplane you are jumping into, because they have a different design philosophy between the 2 big airline companies like Airbus, which is really automating the airplanes and has an architecture and a focus on doing that, while Boeing has actually a more gives more tactical feedback, etc., to the pilot. So which is best of those two architectures? Well, both are good. So there's very few accidents with airlines. But there is something interesting as well happening if you are looking into deeper into the kind of accidents that happens still with airplanes. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of that. So in 2009, in the 12th of February, you had flight 3407 flying from Newark in York and over to Buffalo. So this is quite a short flight. It's probably maximum 1 hour. And what happened was that this plane, it crashed. It crashed when it was flying into the airport of Buffalo. There was 2 pilots. The pilot was Marvin Renslow. He was 47 years old. And you had Rebecca Shaw, that was 24 years old. So both of these pilots, they were quite experienced. Even Rebecca, though she was quite much younger. So what happened if we look at the incident reports? Well, what happened was that suddenly, approaching Buffalo, the airplane controller suddenly starts to shake. And the reason why this airplane controller is starting to shake is that the plane is losing its lifting force. So what do? The autopilot, it disconnects. It basically says, this is an out of the ordinary situation. I can't control this. You have to, take control of the situation, and left the control over to the pilots. I think this was a Bombardier plane, a dash plane. So what do if you lose your lift force? Well, basically what you should do is drop the front of the nose of the plane down to gain some more speed, because normally you have too little speed, because that's correlated to the lift force. So what happened was that Marvin, when he got control, he did the exact opposite. So he did the exact opposite what you actually should do. So he pulled the controller in the other way and basically lifted the nose, which meant that the speed was going down. And then the plane's stall avoidance system, it kicks in, because suddenly the plane is going almost into stall, and then it's going to just fall down. And what Marvin does then is he pulls even harder. So he's basically fighting against the artificial intelligence or the autopilot in this plane. And a few seconds later, the plane crashed. And so if then we are seeing a situation where you are having pilots that really can't control the situation when it gets so intense, do we really need the pilots? I think that's a valid question. And the question here is, I was in New York